Welcome to Open World Chat. I'm John Odom and my co-host is Liane Allen, and this time around we're talking to Assistant Professor of American Studies at Paderborn University in Germany, Alexander Dunst. Alex has written frequently about comics, which we talk a lot about, but today we're talking about those thicker things without the pictures. I believe they call them books. Among other things, Alex is a scholar of writer Philip K. Dick, whose work has, of course, been adapted into several Hollywood films, for better and for worse. So, this installment we go full NPR on your all's butts, as our discussion of the impact and implications of Dick's work brings us to topics such as artificial intelligence, the stigma of mental illness, and we get to say libertarian, anarcho, pacifist. And how cool is that? Here's the conversation. Philip K. Dick. And, you've done some work studying his work. You've edited a collection of essays about his work and written yourself. It seems like there's an awful lot to dig into about this guy. I mean, you could take any one of his novels, and I'm trying to avoid the desire to be a fanboy and say, "Oh, what'd you think of Ubik, or what'd you think of Man in the High Castle, or this or that or the other thing?" Any one of those questions could take us 2 hours.
Definitely, yeah.
So, I mean, maybe the first thing I'll throw out there to you is, what draws you to him, as an academic study?
That's a good question. I think for a lot of people, that has been a difficult question. I once organized a sort of workshop with someone called Larry Rickles, who's a science fiction critic, among other things. And he said, I was educated as a literary critic, and as a literary critic, there's nothing to say about Philip K. Dick. He's not a good writer. And I thought that was sort of interesting. And Larry comes from a very sort of traditional, I don't know, maybe he did his PhD at Yale or somewhere like that, very sort of traditional way of approaching literature. And I think if you do, Philip K. Dick is not the Shakespeare, although there's that famous quote, I think, by Frederick Jameson, that he's the Shakespeare of science fiction. But I think that should be taken with a grain of salt. I just always found him fascinating. I found him, it's so much fun to read Philip K. Dick, and it's so odd, all of his writing, start to finish, that you're just left sort of puzzling about what this is all about. I mean, on some levels, it's very clear, no? I mean, a lot of the novels are sort of science fiction novels in many ways, but even those are sort of odd. I was rereading some of the stuff from the 1950s, and it's if he's kind of cramming in every single science fiction trope he can find. It's not just sort of spaceships or aliens or time travel. He's doing all of it. And then there are, of course, the kind of famous little quirks, the sort of electrical or electronic sort of insects that then spout sort of ads and these sort of lovely things. So really, I think what brought me to Philip K. Dick was just sort of enjoyment of his reading in the very simple sense, and then this just feeling being constantly puzzled by what he was up to. I don't know if you two feel the same, but he's not. I don't think you can ever give an easy answer or an easy interpretation of any of his novels, and I think that's great. That's what keeps us coming back to him.
Mm-hmm. I was really taken by Stanislaw Lem's assessment, where he says, and I'm going to quote, essentially, it's always one and the same world, which figures in his novels, a world of elementally unleashed entropy, of decay, which not only, as in our reality, attacks the harmonious arrangement of matter, but which even consumes the order of elapsing time. So, just he kind of found that as the underlying thread in everything, that, things decay, things fall apart, and this is what the world evolves into as a result.
The disintegration is constantly there, definitely. And I do think it starts with this sort of fragility of the self for Philip K. Dick, which I think was one that he personally felt throughout his life. And I know that John was interested in that sort of question, but then it extends to everything else. No, I mean, entropy is something that post-World War II writers are very interested in general. I mean, Thomas Pynchon would be another example in his early short fiction. But it also, I think, and that's one of the things that's interesting about the early science fiction, is that the plots also are constantly about to fall apart. No, it feels as if he's trying to rescue his own plots or his own novels from kind of being derailed in this probably methamphetamine sort of fueled sort of what he called sort of automatic writing of his. I mean, it's amazing to think about how many novels he wrote. I think I read up on this today. I think it was 44 all in all that were published as novels. So that's pretty impressive for someone who didn't live to be very old.
You know, I've been trying to, just earlier today, I was trying to put him sort of in context of the sort of science fiction diaspora. There are some big names that have really shaped, I think, what we think of, what the popular culture thinks of as science fiction. I mean, people like Asimov, Heinlein, Le Guin, certainly Gibson, and he's right there too. But he's an odd duck, and I was trying to think, what thematically speaking, what family does he live in terms of those bigger names? And the one that I came up with was actually Mary Shelley, thinking of Frankenstein. Am I just off the deep end there? I mean, so much of what he's interested in seems to be the nature of identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point that you're making. Maybe he's also, as Shelley was, a kind of fictionalizing philosopher in a sense. And I don't really so much mean that he writes about philosophy. It seems really that most of his reading in philosophy was really based on kind of dictionaries of philosophy, and it wasn't a sort of deep reading where he would go to sort of Plato every week, that sort of thing. But I think he took a lot from what he read and then applied that. And I think he's amazing in actually sort of turning the surroundings that he grew up with and experienced, and really that's kind of California, no? From the kind of late 1940s to the early 1980s, into a kind of theater for philosophizing about this very interesting period in history. So maybe I can see that. I don't think he's interested in monsters, no, but as you say, he's interested in identity and the kind of fundamental problem of identity or the self in this sort of post-World War II mass society. That's definitely a problem that I feel he constantly returns to without maybe ever coming up with a solution. But I think that's what sort of drives the writing over 40, 50 years. I was also, when you were saying that I think that's a really interesting point. Somehow he doesn't really belong to any of these writers. Now, with Le Guin, he had a famously sort of difficult relationship anyway. Heinlein, I thought, or I think he sort of admired in a way, although he was very critical of Heinlein politically. But I tend to think of Philip K. Dick as a kind of outsider artist in a way, in the sense of outsider art as being something, as being an art produced by someone who doesn't have a kind of conventional education or hasn't gone to art school and has very little contact in a way with the art world or the literary establishment. And he's really a sort of outsider in an interesting way. He sort of went to UC Berkeley for only 2 months, and he had sort of problems with his mental health and possibly one of his first mental breakdowns as soon as he went there. And he was never really part of anything, I think, after that, and never really established himself in the sort of literary world, maybe until he died, or at least until the late 1970s.
That's interesting. It makes me realize that, there's kind of a theme that appears a lot of kind of entities, whether they're human or not, who are outsiders within the society trying to find their place, or as in, androids dream of electric sheep, it's, do they get to survive at all? Society deciding to reject them, or them kind of finding their way in and trying to make it. And that seems to show up in a few places.
I think all of his protagonists are outsiders. They're always struggling. They're struggling to stay afloat. They're struggling to form meaningful relationships. They're struggling to stay sane. They're, often they're struggling to open their door because it's one of his sort of weird science fiction things where you have to pay to open the door and this sort of thing. They struggle with their own masculinity, most of them, which then makes it so funny that, you then get to Arnold Schwarzenegger and all sorts of kind of emblems of this kind of 80s, 90s masculinity playing his sort of protagonists, when really they're more like, I don't know, William H. Macy, maybe, no, or Woody Allen at a time when maybe you could still talk about.
Right. The less said, the better there, right?
Yeah. But they're certainly not action heroes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's odd. But I guess that's a Hollywood take on Philip K. Dick.
That Hollywood thing is so interesting, too, because there's been so many films based on his work, and then so many others, things like The Matrix, which are clearly take inspiration. How is Hollywood doing with that? I mean, Total Recall is a perfect example of one that seems to, have some of the essence there, but is seriously dumbed down from the source material.
I mean, I think Hollywood just takes what it needs from Philip K. Dick and disregards the rest. And, maybe that's what Hollywood needs to do. I mean, it's an economic, it's a business, even if it's show business. I think part of what happened there as well is that Philip K. Dick became business for his family and his children. Not all of the children are involved with the kind of trust, but I remember going, I think this was in maybe 2013, going to California State University at Fullerton. That's where the Philip K. Dick archive always was. I mean, that was established when Dick moved down to Fullerton in Orange County and struck up a friendship with a professor there and some of the graduate students. And in return, he said, okay, you can have my archive. And I was going down there expecting to find much of, everything that he'd left. And then when I showed up there, they said, oh no, most of the archive has been taken back by the family because they're selling it to UC Berkeley. And the figure was somewhere between $1 and $3 million for selling this archive. Had been offered to Fullerton, but Fullerton doesn't have that sort of money. It's mostly a kind of sort of suburban working class university. And Berkeley was able to pay that money. But the interesting thing was that the family still retained all the rights. So basically what stayed in Fullerton was stuff that wasn't interesting for Hollywood. But every single scrap down to, a sentence written on a piece of paper was taken to sort of Berkeley. So I think it's just become big business. And I think if it supports the Philip K. Dick's children and grandchildren, that's great. But as someone who's interested in Philip K. Dick's novels, I personally would like to see sort of wackier adaptations, a kind of Dickian sensibility. Mark Bold, who's this English critic, he said, so instead, in a Hollywood adaptation of Dick's novels, instead of Dick, you get a bunch of dicks. You can edit this out, of course, later, John. And I think that's really what happens. You get these hyper-masculine sort of protagonists, but that's not Philip K. Dick.
You mentioned politics. Of course, it's what we love to talk to here, but I have a very hard time getting my mind around the concept of what this man's political, views could possibly have been. I guess it depends on whether his writings were essentially mind-bending games he would do with himself. But no, you get the feeling they're more than that they're really coming from him, which means he's setting up, a views of not just identity, but reality as so relativistic and subjective. How do you derive a politics out of that?
I think you can derive sort of half a dozen politics out of it at the very least. No, you can take your pick and you can say, oh, I'm going to take the early science fiction novels or the late science fiction novels or the exegesis, which I think is a really sort of interesting text, really one for the Philip K. Dick geeks. I mean, a lot of the early sort of science fiction critics that read and Philip K. Dick and wrote about him and met up with him, there's a couple of interesting stories there as well, thought his texts were Marxist, but that was probably because they were sort of Marxist critics. I tend to think of Philip K. Dick as, okay, this is going to be a long term, a libertarian anarcho-pacifist. And there's a reason for that, because basically, so when Philip K. Dick, when he was still living in Berkeley, just after he dropped out of the University of California there, he moved in with Robert Duncan, who was this San Francisco Renaissance sort of poet of the 1940s. This was the only time Philip K. Dick actually had a sort of connection with the literary establishment, because they lived in a shared house together for a few months. But that was really the politics of that kind of circle. And Philip K. Dick sort of liked to be called a kind of Berkeley beatnik by his wife at the time. And I think that kind of captures his politics. But he was never politically active. No, I mean, his politics was in sort of writing these novels and expressing his kind of dystopian fears about society. But he was never actually interested in sort of organized politics of any kind. No, especially during the 1960s. Yeah.
He did speak about, make critiques of culture pretty explicitly.
He did. And I think that's political in itself. But he wasn't one of those writers who will, joy, maybe this is old fashioned, sort of joy in protests and I think it's coming back, that sort of direct political engagement is coming back in the literary scene as well. But that wasn't something for Dick. He would write his novels at points. He would hang out in a sort of commune that he'd established. But he was ultimately a very sort of private person and very suspicious. And I think if you're not going to be a political activist, I think, if you're suspicious constantly of what other people are up to.
What about the P word there? Paranoid. Would you go that far?
To say that Philip K. Dick was, I don't think that's a controversial statement. The novels are certainly paranoid. He was certainly paranoid. I mean, what I was referring to earlier, there was a meeting, I think, in the early 70s, where some of these kind of Marxist critics, Frederick Jameson, who still teaches at Duke, Dr. Suvin, met up with Philip K. Dick. They were interested in his work. And then I think a year later or something, he wrote a letter to the FBI saying, these Marxists are after me and you should put them under surveillance. So there was definitely an element of paranoia there. But I don't know. I've written quite a bit about paranoia. I also think that all of us are paranoid at certain points in our lives. And maybe being paranoid isn't always negative, as long as you retain an element of doubt and skepticism. I think it's maybe a good idea to sometimes be paranoid in this world. But maybe I just read too many Philip K. Dick novels.
Oh, they'll mess with you. What did you say? Libertarian anarcho-socialist? See,
anarcho pacifist.
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 I don't think it would be right to really call him left wing. He was always very skeptical of anything that was systematic, any form of organized politics, any form of kind of organized revolt or protest. That was never his thing, even in the late 1960s, when, many people actually thought that would sort of change the United States and the rest of the world. He always took his distance from that. I mean, he talked at some point about his youth in politically active Berkeley. But I think it's, that quote is kind of helpful because he doesn't talk about his politically active youth. Right. Even there's a sort of distance between where he is and what he's observing. I think there's something, though, if I can add to that, something for everyone in Philip K. Dick. I mean, I could also see how you could be a sort of conservative Republican reading some of these dystopian novels about state surveillance, and you could read that from this sort of very conservative perspective, which isn't my perspective. I don't think it was Philip K. Dick's, but I think they're open to those sort of readings, a lot of his novels. I don't know. Maybe there's a lot of Republican Philip K. Dick fans out there. I don't know. I've never met any, but who knows?
Yeah, Republicans reading science fiction, at least in the U.S., is not a big thing.
Tell it to the Enders novels. What's his name?
There is definitely a strain. No, there's a kind of millenarian Republican science fiction strain. But I agree. No, a lot of science fiction readers tend to be more on the kind, and a lot of science fiction writers, I think, as well, tend to be more on the left.
So, if you're PKD, and this is coming from you, all these books, this is all not just a mind game, but they're really an expression of who you are and how you see the world. How does that not lead you into total nihilism? This sort of idea that, he's so postmodern, post-structural, if you want to get into some of that, where reality depends on where you are at the time. Identity depends on what people might be projecting onto you. I mean, this stuff becomes so fluid that it loses any kind of sort of objectiveness. Then you could get into what matters? Does anything matter? Blah, blah, blah.
I see that in the description, in this kind of dystopian description of contemporary society. But for me, Philip K. Dick is really a humanist at heart. I mean, there's this idea that I think remains pretty constant, which you can't say of a lot of his ideas, I think. I mean, he's constantly throwing ideas around and changing his opinion on a lot of different subjects. But there's this idea of caritas that he's really constantly referring to as a sort of love, as a sort of fundamental human care. And that's what makes us human. And that's what distinguishes what's real from what's not real, what's authentic from what's inauthentic, and what's human from what's non-human. Now, to the extent that, of course, in a lot of the 1960s novels, it's the kind of the robots or the androids that are human because they extend some of this care or love, despite the fact that they're not maybe made of flesh and blood or born in the same sort of way. I mean, I think that's why Blade Runner is a good film ultimately. I mean, for many other sort of technical reasons, but also because it understands that message, because ultimately it's a film about sort of love and care that remains until the end. And it's not just about sort of spectacle, which I think a lot of other Philip K. Dick adaptations are. But it's a constant fight, I think, for Philip K. Dick to sort of remind himself and his readers of that sort of humane element in society. I can understand it's difficult to keep believing in that, especially at the moment.
If you look at, what was it, The Commuter? I think that actually plays a role in the, that there's this utopian world that he could choose to live in. And then there's the real world, which is a very different place. And I think that the whole caring about those in the real world is a part of what is drawing back toward the real world, despite the pain, the misery, the drudgery.
And there's a lot of that, the pain and the misery and the drudgery. I think those are the parts that are very often interesting about Philip K. Dick's novels. But of course, Hollywood can't include those because, you can't imagine, I think, a Hollywood movie about drudgery. No,
right.
That's not what it does. That's not why we go to the movies, to see drudgery.
Well, not intentionally.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
There was one thing I wanted to do over the last week before we talked. I went online. I started poking around, looking at AI technology. I found this interesting website, this interesting service. I don't want to advertise for services, but it was called Replica, where you're actually downloading your own personal AI. They get to know you over, the coming weeks. And, obviously this is monetized to an extent. And what I did was I went to some of the community sites, like the Facebook sites, where people will talk about this as a product, but then they really start speaking about their AI friend as their personal friend. I go there because I feel like we're starting to more and more, our lives are starting to look like some kind of PKD novel here. Would this surprise him? Would this horrify him? Or is it just like, yeah, this is what people are doing. We're creating artificial friends, and who's to say that they're not somehow just as legitimate friends? Or is it wrong? Or was it all a cautionary tale? He'd be like, "Oh my God, why aren't you listening to me? Get the hell away from this."
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure he would be surprised, maybe horrified. I also think, though, AI is an interesting topic, and I've been doing sort of completely different work, not related to Philip K. Dick, but in a relatively new field in the humanities called the digital humanities. And there's a lot of work involving artificial intelligence that is now helping humanists to sort of study literature and culture. And I think Philip K. Dick is interesting because in Philip K. Dick, the sort of technology always malfunctions at some point. No? It's always a product and it always malfunctions. And I do think that's the case with AI very often too. I do think we sort of tend to forget that artificial intelligence is usually just lots of human intelligence packaged neatly, and then these companies act as if it wasn't sort of underpaid sort of workers actually establishing all this stuff and making all these decisions. And then it's presented as something that's somehow completely divorced from human intelligence. I don't think that's really the case. I mean, I think artificial intelligence can do some interesting and some helpful things. It can do some sort of scary things, but I think ultimately it's still based on human intelligence. So the artificial is a bit of a sort of misleading term, in the same way that sort of cloud computing is misleading, because it's not stored in the cloud, it's stored in huge server farms. Yeah. And I think Philip K. Dick is really helpful there sometimes, because he always insists on the fact that there's just a lot of sort of advertising speech out there, mm-hmm. and a lot of sort of malfunctioning and cheap technology. In a lot of the early novels, there's people that take these really sort of cheaply built sort of spaceships to sort of outer space, to sort of a planet they want to emigrate to. And it's all about how they're sort of always constantly falling apart, and they're sold on sort of lots just, for cheap money when they're falling apart. So I think he's helpful. That reading should be done. Philip K. Dick and artificial intelligence. I hope someone does that. Maybe someone has done it already.
Yeah. related to the topic, I heard a story this week about a recent use of AI. Because of COVID and other things, they were trying to predict who was likely to survive because care had to be rationed. So, they put together an AI, a neural network that would just, be run on some training sets, and it was just codes that they were given. You get these medical codes that'll be, 12 digits long, and it means that it was, this procedure for this kind of thing or whatever. And it ended up being extremely accurate, like surprisingly accurate, maybe in the 90% range. And people were stunned because it was the first time with the data training set and the whole deal. And in the end, it turned out that it was so accurate because one of the codes included was whether or not a priest had been called to the bedside. So it was very, very good at predicting that you were going to die if that code was in your data set.
I think that's a good example. I think it's very important that we all learn a little more about artificial intelligence now, and these sort of things that you're talking about, sort of neural network and training sets, and I think once people understand what actually feeds into this so-called artificial intelligence, that it is sort of decisions made by humans, a lot of work, sort of annotating data made by humans, then maybe people will be less afraid that this is something that is beyond our control. I think it's taken beyond our control because it's often sort of privatized by these huge sort of software monopolies we have now. But I don't think it's something that's inherently evil or inherently bad. And I think Philip K. Dick would certainly understand that, because he was always sort of very much in tune with what was sort of happening technologically sort of at the time. And a lot of the stuff that he theorizes later on in the exegesis is really about sort of information technologies and changes in information technology. So it was definitely a subject that he was picking up on. And interestingly, in California, where all of this, of course, sort of started with large software companies around that time in the 1980s.
I love where this conversation has gone. This is so interesting. I would be remiss, because it's a big hole, I think, when you talk about this guy and his works. And I know it's not particularly what you're looking at, but the subject of mental illness. I mean, that seems like such a critical part to who he was. That really, how much do you think that informed his writing?
I agree that we should talk about this. I do think it's a really important topic when we talk about Philip K. Dick, because I think it also can break down some stereotypes that people still have, maybe about sort of mental health issues, but also about this relationship between the sort of artist or writer and mental health. There are a lot of sort of romantic ideals there still, that you need to be a little cuckoo to sort of be a good artist or a good writer. I mean, I think we can say that Philip K. Dick had mental health issues for his entire life, and he sought out help constantly. I mean, he was in therapy when he was 19 years old. I think for the first time, he remained in therapy for long periods of his life. He self-medicated. He took a lot of sort of psychopharmacology. I think the thing that's important, though, is not to say, or the big question is not sort of, was Philip K. Dick crazy, or was he psychotic, or sort of what sort of diagnosis would we apply to Philip K. Dick? Because he really, he read obviously voraciously, but one thing that he read constantly was sort of psychiatric and psychotherapeutic and psychoanalytic work. Starting from sort of Jung, who's, I guess, more or less forgotten as a psychoanalyst, to really sort of neurological work in the 1970s that was sort of going on and that was cutting edge at the time. He was hugely informed about all this. And I think one of the things that he did is that he used a lot of contemporary diagnosis to sort of think about himself in these terms. He was constantly self-diagnosing. He would write these sort of imaginary dialogues between himself and a therapist, where this therapist would give him a diagnosis and then he would disagree and would say, no, but it's not paranoid schizophrenia, it's a sort of different diagnosis, etc., etc. So he was hyper aware of these things, and he was using these diagnoses to constantly reframe how he understood his life and his own mental health problems. And really these kind of changing diagnoses, because of course psychiatry was constantly changing at the time too. You know, this was a time when Philip K. Dick was in his teens and he first had psychotherapy, he went to a Jungian therapist. So this was really sort of at the height of the sort of importance and influence of psychoanalysis in the United States. And then at the end of his life, all he talked about were these kind of sort of neurological interpretations, mental health as really a sort of brain issue, kind of biological model of mental health. I think we're kind of going away from that again to an extent. I think that's really necessary if you see what the kind of dependence on psychopharmacology does to people, and the fact that it's so easy to get prescriptions for psychopharmacology, so difficult very often to get sustained psychotherapeutic attention. And I don't need to tell you in the US what sort of, you know, painkillers and all these sort of things have done to people. But Philip K. Dick was also really a victim of that. I mean, he first was prescribed, you know, sort of medical speed, Ritalin, really, I think in the 1940s when he was a teenager. And he never really, to my understanding, was able to shake that habit. He sustained a lot of his writing, but ultimately it might have also contributed to his, you know, quite sort of early death and definitely ill health during the last sort of 6-7 years of his life. Sorry, that was a long rant, but this is
great.
Actually a topic I'm very interested in.
Yeah, no, it's a big topic.
Now,
although I would argue that Jung has been forgotten, not by science fiction and fantasy fans, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think Philip K. Dick is one of the reasons. Philip K. Dick was a Jungian, you know, that's more than anything else. I would argue that that's how he understood the world, from a Jungian perspective. But sorry, Liane, you were going to say.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, you know, knowing this aspect of him and his exploration of his own psychological condition, how much of that do you think informed the way that he explores reality and perception within his writing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that maybe it was both a blessing and a curse. I think it's difficult to imagine Philip K. Dick's fiction as existing sort of independently from his experiences with sort of hallucination, with depression, with mania. And I think that's maybe an important point, you know, because it also shows that these experiences, although they can often be sort of painful and troubling, can also add something to the imagination. And I think they certainly did in the case of Philip K. Dick. I mean, they gave him a lot of the sort of source material for his writing, whether that's, you know, in Time Out of Joint, there's a kind of reality that disintegrates. I think it's called the soft drink stand, and this character goes up to the soft drink stand and asks for a beer, which is sort of odd. But then in the end, it kind of falls apart. It sort of disintegrates. And there's so many of these scenes in Philip K. Dick where some kind of consensus social reality just disintegrates. I don't think we would have a lot of Philip K. Dick novels if not for those experiences.
Well, we have taken up so much more of your time than I promised we would. I hope that's okay. You're
of course, yeah.
Patient and gracious. I don't know, Liane, did you have any?
Well, I mean, before we go, is there something you wished we had covered? in this hour?
Oh, I think one thing that is interesting in that people don't talk too much about is the exegesis, which is this huge piece of sort of autobiographical speculation that he wrote after, another series of visions or hallucinations, whatever you want to call them, in or after 1974. And there's a kind of 900-page edition of this, which is a short version of, I think, about 8,000 pages that exist. I haven't read the 8,000 pages. I read the 900 pages, and I think you can help transcribe. There's a project at, I think it's Pennsylvania State University, helping to transcribe these kind of handwritten notes. And I think that's sort of the last and longest of his works. And it's not a novel, it's not an easy read, but if someone's interested in Philip K. Dick, I can really recommend it. All of the things, or many of the things that I think we as Philip K. Dick fans love about him, the constant bursts of ideas and the speculation and often sort of very touching reflections, they're all in there. So that's definitely a book I would recommend beyond all my other sort of favorite novels. But that is a good one that people don't read too much.
Cool. Definitely. I don't know it. I'm going to have to look for it now. You've given me something to do this evening with my glass of wine. Well, evening for us.
Yeah, I will have a glass of wine now too, but it's relatively late. It's 20 after 11, so one glass of wine and then
it's dinner time here. Well, thanks so much. I've had a blast.
Great. Thank you too. But yeah,
thank you so much.
Thanks for talking.
Take care. Our theme music is by Chris Piatek.